in the uncompleted argument, you write that this line has been quoted many times. The truth is that there are no races. And I think in later work, you seem somewhat more sympathetic to the view that there are races, provided we understand them as social identities of some sort. So how has your view on this evolved, or if at all, indeed?
So, I mean, it's changed. I think one reason, there are sort of many levels here to think about. One is just to ask, what sort of question is this ontological question? And when I wrote that, I was coming out of a period when I had spent a lot of time doing philosophy of language, and I wrote a book about assertion and conditionals, and I wrote a book called For Truth in Semantics, which is a discussion of Michael Dummett's anti-realism and a critical discussion.
Oh, I remember that when I was an undergraduate, and Dummett was all the rage.
Yes,
and
yes.
He's now faded somewhat.
Yes, faded. But in the course of that, it didn't occur to me, because I think it just wasn't part of the way we thought about things at that point, how much questions about meaning are, in the end, in a certain sense, normative questions. That is, it's not so much, as it were, what the word race means independently of what anybody cares about. It's, how ought we to use this powerful word? That seems at least as important a question as kind of trying to do the other interesting and important task, which is to try and map, which is the job that lexicographers and linguists do, which is try to map how people are actually using the word and develop theories about how you should model how people are using words. But that's what semanticists in linguistics do. They try to model how words are actually being used, and also they develop theories about what's going on in the minds of people who are using words. That's all very important. The descriptive task is hugely important, but in the end, we've got to use these words, and we've got to use them well. We've got to use them to make life better and not worse. And words that classify people, particularly like the gender words and the race words, and also I think the nationality and religion words and a whole bunch of other words, need to be handled with care. So, but at that time I was just thinking about this as a matter of fact. Either the word race refers to something or it doesn't. It doesn't seem to me that the candidates for things that it could be referring to exist. There isn't anything in the world that behaves in the way that, as I understood it, most people use the word race, intend it to work. And so I thought that the most simplest way to describe that situation is to say that, look, there aren't any of these things. You think they have to be like this. There's a list of things that you think anything would have to be a race. Turns out there isn't anything that meets all those conditions. That isn't the only way you can think about what the question is, because another way to think about what the question is in general, it's going to be the case that a lot of what people think about things is wrong, and they may even think that some of the wrong things they think may be criterial. They may be things such that they think that they have to be true of that, and they can just be confused in various ways that mean that the best job you can do of giving an account of their linguistic behavior is going to be to offer a best candidate for the referent, to say that this will not fit with all the thinking, all the commitments of the speakers, but that if you're trying to keep track of roughly what they're up to, this will do. So, on that, and that's true of a lot of things. I mean, I don't think there are genes in the sense in which most people probably think there are genes, because they don't know how complicated the mechanisms are that take you from a sequence of DNA to a protein, and they don't understand that along the way there are other bits of DNA doing things that are sending messages to the first bits of, and because they don't know that, they don't, as it were, have a view that's incorrect. They just, well, I mean, they have a view that's incorrect because they just think, well, a gene is a sequence of DNA that determines a protein, and as it were, that's all there is. That's what people think. Well, that isn't true. So in the way in which the people normally use the word gene, there aren't any genes, but there are good candidates for being a gene if once you know more biology. So and I think often we have choices to make. I mean, Descartes wrote a treatise on the passions, right? And in it, he speaks about what in English are called animal spirits. A lot of what Descartes says about animal spirits is true of electrical impulses traveling down nerves. And since he was trying to explain how nerves work, one possible translation for his Latin expression, animal spirits, would be nerve impulse.
Yep.
Because it's got the word spirit in it, people don't like that. So they want to say there aren't any animal spirits. But we could just as well say that there are impulses, and that a lot of what Descartes says in the Treatise of the Passions about impulses, about animal spirits, is true of impulses. So if you're trying to make sense of him, it's as good a candidate as any. So, so I have a more complicated view about what the task is, as it were, than I did, because I was prejudiced by a way of thinking in the philosophy of language that I think is mistaken. So having said all that, I would still be inclined to say that the most useful thing to say, I think, is a large part of what most people most educated people think about race remains false. It remains the case after 50 years of careful arguments for social constructionism of various sorts, that most people think race is way more sort of biologically significant than it actually is. I do not want to deny to philosophers of biology the possibility that looking through the sciences of human classification, of animal classification, and thinking of us as an animal, there may be useful things to be said about the structure of variation in human populations, which correspond to some of the things people used to say about race. And so if you want to use the word race for that, go ahead, but please don't confuse the rest of us, because those truths about, such as they are, about the structure of the structure of variation, the statistical structure of variation of genetic properties in human beings, or in sequences of DNA, which is not the same thing, is not relevant to deciding whether someone is black or white or Asian in the United States. It's not relevant because while sometimes people use properties of people that do have an interesting distribution in the human population, and about which there are interesting statistical things to be said about the connection between those characteristics and continental populations and so on. While that is true, Walter White, who was the president of the NAACP through the middle of the 20th century, who was not only called white, but looked white and had blue eyes, was an African-American as far as I'm concerned. And as far as he was concerned, he called himself a Negro. And I don't see how any biological facts about the distribution of human genetics are going to help you understand why he's clearly an African-American. So in other words,
on the other hand, sorry, can I just interrupt you there?
Yes.
But so to bring in the converse case, Rachel Dolezal seems not to have been black.
Good. But not.
And well, of course, there's if you think that it's a matter of ancestry or belonging to some continental population, then you have an easy explanation of why she isn't.
Yes, you have an easier one than the one I have to give. But the one I have to give is that if you call yourself an African-American in the United States, there are a bunch of things that everybody will assume. And almost all of them were false of her. And so it was deeply misleading to say what she said. That those things, in my view, don't matter very much is not up. The answer to that is it's not up to you, Appiah. It's up to Americans generally and social practices generally. I would like those social practices to change. And if they were to change in the way that I would like, I think Rachel Dolezal would be allowed to claim that she was black, and it wouldn't be misleading for her to do so. Right. But to do that, you have to do work, social work. You have to change things, and that's what trans people have done. It was misleading 50 years ago for a person who would now identify as trans to say, let's say trans man, I'm a man. It would have been misleading because people would have assumed things, almost everybody would have assumed things that were false. if you said that. Now, that's not true. You know, educated people know that what it is to be a man includes trans men, at least in the view of some, and so they don't assume that when you say you're a man, you're not. You don't. You know, you're not a trans man. So, so if Rachel Dolezal were in the work of abolishing sort of biologically understood race and in favor of replacing it with a cultural understanding, she could do that. She could say that. I mean, it's too late now because she's discredited herself by trying to cheat.
Someone else will have to take up that torch.
Someone else, and there are people who want to take that up. Yeah. There's a guy, there's an African American, though I'm not sure that he wants me to call him that, who lives in Paris.
You mean Thomas Chatterton Williams?
I mean Thomas Chatterton Williams, who of course, it's misleading to say that it would be misleading to say that he doesn't think he's African American, because he doesn't think anybody's African American.
Right.
And so
yes,
just
exactly.
saying he doesn't think he's African American is misleading in that context. He doesn't think anybody's white either. So, or at least that's his hope. His hope is that we get to a point where that's true. And so that, and he has a daughter who actually sounds a bit like she might have been Walter White's granddaughter, because she's a little blonde kid. With
yes, exactly. And I think it was the revelation that his daughters looked white and had blonde hair and blue eyes that changed his mind, I think. About
yes, because before that he had written a book. He'd written a book about
Losing My Cool.
Yes, and you know that was. And in that, he clearly was identifying as an African American. So he's shifted. So this, I haven't answered your question though about what I now think, really, because I guess, you know, if I'm on an airplane and somebody asks me what I do and I'm foolish enough to say I'm a philosopher, they say very often, "What's your philosophy?" And I used to think that I would have to explain why that wasn't a good question. But now I say, everything's more complicated than you thought is my philosophy. And it sort of is. So if you, I wrote I wrote 2 philosophy textbooks, but I wrote a philosophy textbook at the end of which I said, if you want to know what philosophy is, apply the Ramsey sentence strategy to this book. Take out every instance of the word philosophy and say philosophy is the X such that all these things are true of it. And that's about, I think that really is the best way to explain what philosophy is, which is why an introductory philosophy course is needed and not just 5 minutes with a dictionary to understand
right.
what the word philosophy really means. So, so I think, but I do think it's most useful in the United States, at least, though not everywhere. And that's an important point about the race concept. It's most useful in the United States to think of race as a kind of social identity, to map some of the rules, and to say it's a social identity is to make a nominalist move from a metaphysical point of view. It's to say we have to track the label because we can't track a thing. You've got to track the label. And the nice thing about tracking a label is you can notice that different people apply it differently. It can't be true of a thing that it's both F and not F, at least modulo some claims by some extreme metaphysicians. But but it can be true of a label that different people apply it differently, and maybe the same person applies it on different occasions in ways that have no unifying account. But those are facts, if they're facts, and you can keep a track of them. And so you can try to map how the label operates. And that's what you do when you study a social identity. You study this is something sociologists invented in the 1950s called social labeling theory. You can track how the label works. And this is useful because it means, for example, to take a different case, take the question in Ireland whether someone is a Catholic or a Protestant, right? Well, it turns out that in the north of Ireland anyway, you can be a Protestant Buddhist, and you can be a Catholic atheist. And that's just a fact about how those words work there. You could insist that you can't be a Catholic unless you're willing to claim that the Nicene Creed expresses the truth about something. But then you'll just get lots of people in Northern Ireland wrong for lots of important purposes, like which political party they're going to vote for and what they're going to think about unification with the South. So in that case, however, we can give a very good story about why people get to be Protestant and Catholic, and what happens when Protestants and Catholics have children, about how they get assigned labels and all that. And we can do that with racial terms too. But there's always the question of who the we is, because different people are not doing it the same way. One familiar and obvious example of this was the very different reactions people have to the question whether Barack Obama is African American, right? So he has an African father and an American mother. His American mother was white. Some people think that under our rules, he's not really African American. But the right thing to say there is whose rules? I don't have a view about this, really. I guess my view is a sort of liberal one, which is since he obviously thinks he's black, and since that's not misleading in the American context.
Right. Indeed, he would be treated as
he's pretty much bound to be treated as black on many, many occasions, which wasn't true of Walter White.
Yes.
Right. Walter White was able to do work for the NAACP investigating lynchings because he could appear in a southern town after a lynching and present himself as a white man, and people just assumed he was, and he could ask questions that a black man couldn't have asked. So that's the second thing, right? You've got the labeling. That the labeling goes with two other things, which is treatment, which you just mentioned. People treat people as X's, as Catholic, Protestant, black, white. And they act as X's, and they do things, think with the thought, as a black person, I should do such and such. So as a black person, I shouldn't speak up against affirmative action. Maybe in my heart of hearts, I'm skeptical about it, but I shouldn't. It's letting down the side, as it were. Yeah. And to understand those acts, you have to understand that the person is thinking of themselves as belonging to a certain kind of person, and that kind of person has what I would now call, that it has normative significance for them.
Right. Okay. So you've we should get on to the next question, but let me just pick up a couple of threads before that. So you mentioned the distinction between the normative question, how should we use the word race, and the descriptive question. And indeed, we're reading my colleague Sally Haslanger's famous paper on race and gender. And we're also reading a paper by Quayshawn Spencer, who defends the descriptive answer, a certain descriptive answer to the question, what is race, namely genomic ancestry groups or continental populations. So just to go back to just focusing on the descriptive question and your earlier claim that the truth is that there are no races, is this right, that at that time, so just forgetting the normative issue, you were thinking that race terms, black, white, Asian, and so forth, are clear cases like telepath, that is someone with telepathic powers, mermaid, or phlogiston, where we can all agree that, okay, there aren't any telepaths. It doesn't matter how much I pound the table and insist that I really am a telepath. I'm just wrong. There aren't any mermaids, and there's just no candidate to be phlogiston. So there was no such thing as phlogiston, the gas that was supposedly given off during combustion. And then again, still focusing on the descriptive question, after that, you came to think that, well, it's now not so clear, and it might be more like gene or atom or fish, to take a philosophical example, where we were supposedly confused and thought that whales were fish. So we might, in other words, race could still be biological in some very broad sense. It's just that we tend to be very confused about what race is. Is that a sort of fair description of the evolution of your thinking just on the purely descriptive question?
Well, yes. I mean, for one thing, look, one thing that's happened, this is, I'm glad people are still reading it, but it's an old paper. And one thing that's happened is that the situation has changed in the relevant biological fields in classification. So the paper that I cite in that article by Ney and Roy Chowdhury was a piece of up-to-date genetics. Yeah. Well, you know, because we can now map the whole genome of a human being in a very short period of time, we've now mapped an awful lot of human genomes in great detail. And we can use features of those genomes which weren't available to geneticists because they are looking at, you can look at sequences of DNA that have no function in terms of either regulation or production of proteins, but which are sitting there and holding the chromosome together, and which you can trace back because you can, if you study enough people, you can infer by using computers and models, you can infer how the current distribution was produced by a series of lines of descent. Now, in that work, I think two things there's a lot more to be done, but I think a couple of things have become a bit clearer about this. One of which I always knew, and I think a lot of people, including a lot of biologists, hadn't thought about, which is this. The human population, most of our ancestry comes from a bunch of humans who were in Africa until 100 to 130,000 years ago or something. Some of us have a little bit of ancestry from other hominids, but most of us.
Yeah, I have a big chunk of Neanderthal DNA.
Right. So there are Neanderthal. Even I have some Neanderthal. Not many. Some Africans don't, but a lot of Africans do as well. That means that so the picture that I think a lot of people have is it's like this, right? Roughly. And if it's like that, then, and if selection is going on over 100,000 years along here, as people move into different environments, then you'll get both, of course, you'll get drift, genetic drift, just random stuff happening, but you'll also get you'll also get selection. And so out at the end of this process of spread, there'll be people, the populations which have significantly different distributions of the sampling of genes that they took from the old population, the original population. Now, of course, if that's what happened, and I'm going to say that it didn't happen exactly like that, if that had been what happened, then essentially there would be two reasons why there's difference, why Aboriginal Australians and Yanomamo Indians in Latin America are different. One would be that they just got a different sampling of the original genes, and the other would be that they've been subjected to selection pressures. They and their ancestors on the way there have been subjected to selection pressures. All right. But that isn't what happened. That's one level of what happened. But another level of what happened is that people were constantly coming back. And so it's not the case that a typical, let's say, Indonesian has all her ancestry from some branch of an original tree of the descendants of those Africans who left. First of all, they didn't leave just once, so different samplings, different populations. But even if they'd all left once, that wouldn't have been true, because in the meanwhile, people have been cycling back. And so the idea that as it were, if you're black, and black, I mean African black, 100% black, not black in the way that I'm black because I have some non-African ancestry, recent non-African ancestry. But if that population, the people who looked like that, as it were, that's going to be where most of the variation in the human genome is, because it wasn't very long ago there hasn't been a lot of time for successful selection. And so the vast majority of the human genome is going to be the same everywhere. And furthermore, when it isn't the same, a lot of it is going to be samplings from genes that were floating around in the African population that these people left. So, so the result is that even at the center, but also very much at the periphery, people aren't just the result of a single line. And so if it's true that there are high-level clusterings, statistical clusterings, they'll be, and that, you know, as it were, by definition, there will be some highest level set of statistical clusterings. That's the way that's the way the algorithms are written. Some things are going to be true about it. First, there'll be lots of people that it doesn't make much sense to ask which clustering they belong in, because there'll be lots of places where the clusters blend. It would be like you've got some chlorine gas over here, find some red gas. In here, it doesn't really make much sense to say, you know, the gas is red or the gas is green. There'll be people who come more from there and people who come more from there, but then there'll be, unlike in the gas case, there'll be chemical suppose there were chemical reactions, and now there'll be new stuff. There'll be mixtures that didn't exist before. Mm-hmm. So I think, now I always knew that. I don't know, I mean, and it always seemed obvious to me that that was an important fact about why the picture people had couldn't be right. That picture has been massively confirmed now, because we have much more detail of how these little cycles go. But I knew it because I knew that about Alexander the Great and Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan. And I knew about the Bantu migration. I knew that a couple of thousand years ago, a lot of people who in what's now Cameroon started moving south. And as a result, you know, there's just going to be lots of intermingling of ancestries. And so now it's an interesting question, though not as interesting as I think people seem to think. You know, it's an interesting question, how much of that there is, how much that is, how many, what the highest level clustering is of the variation, and you know, how many people can be satisfactorily assigned to that. Those are interesting questions. I think people are only interested in them in a way because they have a history of caring about race. I think if we hadn't had a history of caring about race, we would be more, the most interesting fact about the human genome is the incredible independence of variations because of the way selection works. So that you know, if you look at large scale phenomena like teeth, they don't correspond hugely well to skin color, for example, nor does skull shape, because and similarly, the genes that make people dark skinned are different in different places, and they're all there for the same selection reason, which is that you have to have a balance between the dangers associated with light skin in places with intense solar radiation near the equator on the one hand, and the need to produce vitamin D on the other. And if you keep your skin dark, if Eskimos had dark skin, they wouldn't be producing enough vitamin D in the limited light that they have access to, and so all over the globe, people get darker as you move towards the equator, for a selection reason, not really, and that means that different genes have been recruited to do the job. I mean, some of them are the same. I don't mean that melatonin is everywhere, but it's produced. The actual color of skin is different in different places. So anyway, given all that, I'm willing to say now that I can see why someone who was interested in the statistical structure of the human genome, the distribution of genomes, would be interested in the question whether there is such a highest level of. Though, as I say, I think that I don't know why that would seem to me the most interesting question about the distribution of human genetic material. Anyway, And what's interesting about it, I mean, what I find interesting in this work is something completely different, which is what it reveals about the history of human migration, which I find an intrinsically interesting topic, that we're such a species for moving around. Yes. But there's much more data. I mean, when I was first thinking about these things, I could sort of read a few articles and there was a consensus. People are working towards new pictures now, which I think is what scientists do, is what they should do. I'm interested in that. But they're not moving towards a picture that's going to resolve the social questions that I think are the important ones for thinking about racial identity in the United States, right, or in the North Atlantic. When you move, if you move to Brazil, racial categories work differently from the way they do here. That's something that a nominalist like me finds easy to explain. It's harder for the racial realist to explain that. But one thing that's true in Brazil is, which is the only country in Latin America I've been to, which is why I'm talking about it, and I don't mean it to suggest that it's particularly representative. I'm just saying it is a Latin American country, and I've been there. Is that negro, their word for a black person, really is a phenotypic word.
Yeah, a color word.
It's a color word, and they can. So there are lots of. So in my family, some people would be negro and some wouldn't, and that includes, and also that's true of all their basic words. They're basically phenotypic. So I have one of my sisters married a Norwegian, and so she has kids of various colors, and they would belong in different categories in Brazil. But in the United States, as they learned when they came here, even though my nephew Christian has blue-gray eyes and blonde hair and looks like any other Norwegian, my African-American godchildren announced to him, to his great surprise, that he was black, because his grandfather was. And this is someone who was born in Botswana and lives in Namibia and is married to a Namibian, so he knows what a black person is in where he lives, and he's not one of those there.